Hello everyone and welcome to the July update on what evidence is suggesting around AI use in education. I am your host, Dr. Lucy Rycroft-Smith, and as always, I've been scouring the research, looking through the evidence to see what I can find to bring you around the ideas of AI use in education and sometimes a bit beyond in case it's of relevance. And as you'll see, that is going to be a little bit important later. So here's the July update. Hopefully I'll be able to bring you monthly updates on what the research is saying about AI use in education. Let's dive in. First one, a little bit of a headline for you. So I've got 3 papers I'm going to talk about during this video, and they're quite representative of what's going on in the field at the moment. So let's start with the first one. Major issue in education, in schools, but also in universities, is AI detection. So this amazing tool that we have been given free access to, free but not free, is being used unsurprisingly by students as well as teachers. And it's causing some problems for assessment, as you can imagine. We have problems with students using AI to create work, passing off as their own. We have a kind of spectrum of use where some students perhaps are using it to do some refining at the end or to detect some grammar or spelling issues. Other students might be doing some thinking, partnering type activities with AI tools, and others might be completely transcribing, transporting, picking up, lifting text from AI straight into their homework. And we want to know if and when students are doing that. So nice paper out which discusses that, which I'll get into, which looks at some different types of model, different types of tool that might be able to detect these things. And the headline there is, it's pretty good at detecting when students have used AI tools to write their essays if they're not modified. But if students or if actual AI tools try to cheat, try to fool the detector by adding some grammar issues, by adding a few things that they think might help to make the text seem more human, it does indeed fool the detectors, and the detectors drop in the accuracy quite substantially. Second one, this comes in a kind of raft of lots of similar papers, all about using ChatGPT for therapeutic uses, particularly in education. And presumably because we have a mental health epidemic in this and many other countries, we have students who are really struggling with their mental health. And rather than address those problems at systemic level, at funding level, which are, difficult problems to solve, we are perhaps asking the question, can AI tools help? Can AI tools act as counsellors for students, maybe through school settings and scenarios, maybe elsewhere? And so I have chosen a paper kind of in this realm, which investigated that, but very oddly, really only asked what I consider to be the wrong questions, not should we be doing this, not what might the consequences be, but a kind of very basic threshold for ChatGPT. Is it warm? Is it empathetic, and is it accepting in the way that it deals with hypothetical student scenarios in a simulation? And it wasn't really in dialogue either. It was just a straightforward one question, one answer, and surprisingly found that it was indeed warm, empathetic and accepting. So that's a good one. And then the last one, which I'm really excited to talk to you about, is I've been looking around, I've been scouring to see if I can find anything about whether AI tools save people time in the workplace, because this is such an interesting topic and it's been widely talked about, and in education quite a lot recently after the recent release of the DFE materials to support AI use in education and the Chartered College Impact Journal, which was the special issue on AI in education. And I'm hearing lots and lots of people say often that ChatGPT and other AI tools have the potential, and sometimes they frame it like that, to save teachers a massive amount of time. And sometimes they don't even frame it like that. They're much more kind of solid in their claim. They say that AI tools do save people time. And I'm yet to find any really substantial evidence to suggest that that's the case. So I'm interested in this one. And you'll see for the headline there that some researchers in Denmark did this study across 11 different occupations. Teaching was one of them. They found an average time saving of 2.8% of work hours, not 2.8 hours, 2.8%, which was not even really statistically significant. And for teachers, the lowest of all, 0.6 to 1% of the work hours they reported as being saved. So they didn't even measure whether it actually was saved. So that's kind of interesting. We'll get into that. So let's start with the first study, which was about detecting AI use in students. So researchers used quite a few essays. We've got over 3,000 essays, and some were human written, some were AI generated, and some were AI generated with changes. So they asked humans of 2 different ages to change them, and they used AI tools themselves to try and affect the detection. So try and make changes that would make them seem like they're more human. Often those were grammar or spelling errors. And the models that they investigated, they went into some detail as to how they worked. And so if you're interested in that, I'll put the paper link at the bottom in the comments. And one thing that I found quite curious, and I'm hoping to be able to interview these researchers about this, is that they measured whether the models agreed with human evaluators. And I've put here these results suggest that the models are highly effective at detecting the AI generated content when it hasn't been changed, but that's provided the humans were, and there wasn't really any information in the paper about whether the humans were or not. So I was really interested to dig deeper into that one. So the 2 models that they have suggested are the most useful have a precision rate. So we've got SVM, precision rate of 99.5% and recall of 99.1%. Now, without getting too technical, the reason there's 2 different measurements here is we've got false positives and false negatives that AI can detect when they're trying to find, AI written text. And so the precision rate is about reducing the risk of falsely accusing students of teaching. And then the recall rate, what they've called the recall rate here, is about minimizing the number of undetected AI generated essays. So false positive, false negatives, which I'll talk about again in a minute. And so we've got the Electra model, precision rate of 98.3 and recall of 98.1. So in essence, these models are very good at finding AI written material when it's been unaltered. My addendum here is interesting because I keep thinking, well, so what? If I'm a teacher or a lecturer, even if I'm a parent and I'm interested in trying to find out whether a student has used AI in the kind of circumstance that I've asked the student and I'm not sure they're being honest with me, I don't know which currently available models use SVM or Electra. I don't really know what most of the current available models use at all, because they don't tend to reveal the kind of online commercial tools. They don't tend to reveal what the underlying models are. It's very hard to find that information. I had a good look and I couldn't find it. And I wonder if that's for competitive reasons. So the so what of this study, and this is only half the study, is how does that help me? Not that much necessarily, because these models are really good, not perfect, but really good at detecting AI written material. But I'm not sure which model, which kind of front end might employ those models underneath the hood at this point. And so how do I know? How can this help me? So interesting question for those researchers in terms of implications. And then here's the second half of the study. The effectiveness of those detection models got a lot worse when the essays were changed, as we'd expect, really. So they asked 8th grade students, so 13 to 14-year-olds, to make changes, and then they asked older students to make changes. And they also asked AI itself, so they asked ChatGPT to make changes to try and humanize the content, to try and avoid detection. And that was great, right? They were good at avoiding detection, because all of a sudden we've got these rates dropping, so 82%, 78%, 76, 72, and then the highest drop when ChatGPT reprocessed its own essays. So it kind of got fed back into the meat grinder and said, make this sound much less AI, please. And we've got these scores from SVM and Electra going to 68% and 63%. So in other words, this study has definitely illustrated the way that AI can be used iteratively to change text, to try and make it sound less AI, to try and bypass detection systems a little more. I think it's worth saying those percentages are still over 50%, still over 60%. So it's definitely not doing an amazing job, but it's doing a better job. And so the implications there for us as educators is, if students get wise to this, if students start to do this, all of a sudden we're in this really odd loop where we're using AI to create content, we're using AI to modify that content, and we're potentially using AI to try and detect that content, and everything is going to get better over time, I would expect. And so relying on these tools, the researchers say, is not enough for maintaining academic integrity. In other words, if you feed it through one of these available tools and it comes out as, well, this is human, or this is AI, or this is somewhere in the middle, what does that actually tell us? We're not sure, because those results aren't reliable, particularly accurate. And where do we go from there practically as an educator? These are huge, important, open questions which we haven't really solved. Some people really quite adamant at this point that this means the end of all written homework or assessment, and actually we need to completely change up the way we're educating students and how they're responding to that education. Other people maintaining that we will get better at detection and we just need to sort of let the tech do its work. There's two reasons why I think that might not work. So the first is what I've just said. We're using AI to do this job. We're using AI to potentially, the students are using it to write the essays. They might also be using it to modify in order to avoid detection. And you can see that that loop will just get better and better. And because we're using essentially all the same types of systems and the same types of tech to do this, as one part of that gets better, the other part is kind of counteracting it. And so I wouldn't necessarily expect detection rates to get much higher than certainly the sort of high 90s, and there's almost no chance they could be 100% as far as I can tell. Please feel free to comment underneath if you have something else to say. The researchers here, and I'll come back to the second reason in a minute, the researchers here suggest as a kind of solution, although I'm not sure I agree, a multifaceted approach integrating advanced machine learning techniques with educational awareness will be critical. In other words, we just need to teach students more about how AI works, maybe teach teachers, I'm not sure. And most of the papers that I read have this kind of similar approach. They say what we need to do is improve student understanding of AI literacy, which seems an odd solution to this problem, and maybe improve the way that teachers see and notice AI. But again, an odd solution to this problem, because again, I'm quite good, I think, at spotting when AI tools have been used. I'm not perfect. But if I have a student who presents with that piece of work, no matter how sure I feel in my own mind as an educator, at this point what I have is a kind of human crisis, right? Because what I want to avoid is falsely accusing students. And this brings me to my second issue. So there's two ways that AI detection tools can get things wrong. We've got the false accusation. So if the model says it's AI, or if I say it's AI, and actually it wasn't. So put yourself in that student's shoes. You've written something, a piece of work. It might be a humanities essay, it might be a piece of maths work, it might even be a piece of artwork, and you present it to your teacher either for assessment or because it's part of homework, and you are told, I know you used AI to create this, or I suspect, and that's not good enough, you've cheated. In that kind of circumstance, what we're doing is disenfranchising students, potentially opening ourselves up to quite a lot of feedback and criticism from the student and the parent, which is very negative. And ultimately, I guess this is going to come down to the lawsuits, as so much of all of this is. Because how do we prove that? Well, we can't, I don't think, at the moment. There might be ways to try and sort of look at a student's history in the way that they've interacted with an AI tool. But I also imagine there are equally easy ways to try and cover that up. There might be ways to prove it. How do you prove you haven't used one, though? Again, I'm putting myself in the position of a student. How do I prove that I haven't used an AI tool? That must be quite difficult. And so what we're starting to do is get into a realm of education that I think could be quite combative, quite difficult, full of conflict. So those false positives we really want to avoid if possible. I think it would be really unpleasant to be accused of that as a student. However, we also have the type 2 errors, so the false negatives. So the model says it's human and it was actually written by AI. And those, we want to avoid too, because what we're essentially doing is letting cases slip through the net. And the way that most things work statistically when you've got false positives and false negatives, and this is true of medical testing, pregnancy testing, COVID testing, things like that, type 1 error and type 2 error get kind of balanced out. In some sense, they're trade-offs. If you want to dial up the kind of reducing type 1 error, you end up with usually, and this is very simplistic, but more type 2 errors. And similarly, if you want to dial up the reducing of type 2 errors, you tend to get a few more type 1 errors creeping in. And so they tend to be dials that are in some way trade-offs of one another. And so this is another reason that I don't think we're going to get to a point where we can start to say very definitively one way or another about student work, because we really do want to try and avoid those false positives. And so there's something here about this kind of predator-prey graph, really, that's going on at the moment that I'm not sure we're going to reach a resolution. But I would be interested to see what technology comes up in order to try and change that kind of narrative. All right, so let's move on to school counselling. So we certainly in this country and in many countries around the world have many issues with student mental health, child mental health. And there's been some suggestion that this may have got worse over the last couple of decades, that students are much more mentally ill than they have been previously. Equally, there's been a suggestion that it's been less stigmatised, they're more comfortable talking about it, they're seeking help more, which potentially is a positive. But within that context, we have a researcher asking the core question: how can AI best be utilised to increase mental health care accessibility and avoid potential risks? And how gradually can AI applications be integrated into various care contexts and populations? And that kind of immediately made me prick up my ears, because I thought, well, that's really quite a lot of assumptions in one go, at the beginning of a paper. Rather than questioning why or if we should use AI, we're asking how can we best use it and how can we best mitigate risks? Well, hold on, let's put the brakes on, because in the same paragraph, this researcher talks about GPT-4, so this version of ChatGPT, which begins to hallucinate client details or omit critical information when prompts exceed about 3,000 tokens. So that's the number of queries you put in, revealing the model's limited working memory. And they also note there have been several cases. This is quite a high profile one. In October 2024, a Florida mother filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Character AI after alleging that her 14-year-old son's suicide was precipitated by an unhealthy dependency on a chatbot persona. And we're starting to see more and more of these lawsuits and these case studies come up where people have interacted with different types of AI tools that have provided what might be called psychological support or counselling and done harm. And there are definitely lots of those cases in existence. So just starting with the assumption that we should use this for this purpose, but we just need to integrate it better, and sort of how can we increase access, for me, is asking the wrong question. So in this study, researchers explored ChatGPT's counselling-oriented capabilities. There's a nice research phrase for you. They essentially gave ChatGPT some questions that they said were frequently asked by college students. Not sure how they determined that. And then they analysed the answers. And they were looking for three things that they described as warmth, empathy, and acceptance. And this is quite a long study. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, because guess what? It will be no surprise to you, and it certainly wasn't to me, that they found very high levels of warmth, empathy, and acceptance. And those are the things generally that chatbots are quite good at doing. Sometimes to bad effect, right? So they can be way too accepting, they can be way too warm, they can be a little over empathetic to the point of sycophancy, which is a big problem in AI tools. What they end up doing is telling you what you want to hear. And I've been looking with interest at some examples of where people have asked ChatGPT to provide this kind of psychological support, and the responses that have come back have led people to develop a sort of sure sense of their own rightness, maybe to their detriment. There's been quite a lot of inbuilt misogyny there. There have been answers that have definitely been damaging or harmful to the person's psyche. And so just asking whether the responses were warm, empathetic, and accepting, I'm not sure, again, are the right questions. They're defined here, so you can see. And the researchers did admit lots of limitations, which is always good. So they said, well, it was just a simulation. This was not a live user situation. I mean, on the one hand, that's not super helpful. On the other, do you want to be really trialing this with real students with real problems, given the ethical limitations? It's tricky, isn't it? Probably not. But I think the clinicians, there's no professionals involved in this. We'll get to that in a minute. The study may not therefore be useful in terms of real-time usability, safety, or conversational dynamics. That was the part that was missing for me. There wasn't enough conversational dynamics. It was just a question and answer. And as somebody said to me recently, it's not called question and answer GPT. So the other thing that struck me is the way they measured warmth, empathy, and acceptance. This is really funny, and you couldn't make it up, I don't think, was inferred by machine learning models. And then finally, there was no input from the relevant people this technology is meant to serve. And as researchers, this is a bit of a no-no. We're not involving the communities, populations of people that could be potentially affected by the tech, and that's not a great idea usually. So no students or professional counsellors. And that's, when I was talking about clinicians, if you're going to analyse responses by AI tools that are supposed to be in the realm of what we would call counselling, which this paper does, perhaps counsellors should help you to evaluate that, professional counsellors. Just a thought. So limitations as discussed by the researchers themselves. So what did they find? Well, as we said, not particularly surprising. They categorized the emotions that they found in the responses. Approval and caring came up the most of them were caring, and they concluded that 97.5% of the replies were coded as warm. They had quite a few interesting anomalies they called sort of random events. So some of the responses were coded as confusion or realization. And so they did say any mistake in psychological counselling can cause unforeseeable harm. And so obvious randomness remains present in the process. Yes, and that's a problem, right? I was just imagining if I was, seeing a therapist and then some small percentage of the time, but quite significant, they were just replaced by a random person on the street giving me their best thoughts. I would be quite worried about that. I think I would find it quite confusing. And maybe even in this situation, I don't know they've been replaced, right? So I think there's lots to think about there in terms of potential harms. So empathy was high, acceptance was high. I questioned their measure of empathy because they just did a sentiment analysis and found it to be very positive. Ultimately, they found that ChatGPT is quite positive in the way it responds to simulated student inquiries. Okay, I think we knew that. So they do conclude rather bizarrely that the application of GPT and potentially other models in the field of psychological counselling shows significant promise, primarily because of the overwhelmingly positive nature of the responses generated. Now, I'm not a professional counsellor or psychologist, but I would suggest that just being overwhelmingly positive is absolutely not enough to be good at your job. Please feel free to tell me in the comments underneath how you measure being good at your job. But coming from my layperson perspective, I would suggest that's not good enough. It's sort of maybe a baseline, but also maybe not even that. As I've said, just being overwhelmingly positive is definitely not the kind of psychological intervention, therapy, counselling that will work for all patients all the time and can definitely lead to harm. There's such a thing as toxic positivity. Also, as we said, the sycophancy issue. So that's a little bit of a worry as a conclusion. And then finally, in the discussion section, I found it. This person ultimately has a commercial product that's related to this, although they've said they're an independent researcher, right? So this is why we should be very, very wary of research. Who's conducting it? Why are they conducting it? And there were multiple red flags in this one for me. And as I said, I've seen quite a lot of papers come out in the last month or so that are looking at counselling. And I suspect there are many, many people, perhaps with, good hearts, good intentions, who are jumping on this bandwagon, trying to make themselves some money, and actually not considering the risks and harms in an important way here, and certainly not reconsidering the assumptions they may have had at the beginning of research. Okay. So finally, my favourite paper that I've read in the last couple of weeks, and this was done by some researchers in Denmark. And they looked at the effect of using AI tools in 11 occupations. Now, just because I say this is my favourite paper, it doesn't mean that I agree with all the premises and all of the conclusions. It was, like every single paper I've read about AI in the last 4 weeks, overwhelmingly positive, even in the face of some very odd results. And I find this hype, this toxic positivity, very concerning generally in the research area and in the media. There seems to be a real kind of blind spot when it comes to criticality. And I'll tell you more about that as it comes up here. So 25,000 workers, a reasonable sized study in 7,000 workplaces. So they did a couple of rounds of questionnaires, 23 and 24. So some of this will really be out of date as well when it comes to adoption. So bear that in mind. I was reading through the occupations with bated breath, hoping that teachers would be there, and they were. They chose these occupations because they suspected that they were occupations that would be, in some sense, most affected by AI in different ways. And so I thought that was an interesting choice. So lots in the study, lots of different findings. One of the findings is that employers are heavily invested, and most tend to encourage their use. Again, bear in mind this was conducted a little while ago because it takes a while to get the research published. We had 38% of the employers in total across all of the occupations using in-house models, and 30% of the employees had received training at that time. I suspect that will be higher now. So despite these substantial investments in AI chatbots, the researchers suggest their overall impact on work remains modest. This is from their study. They said modest. Average time savings of 2.8% of work hours. Again, not 2.8 hours, not 2.8 hours per day or per week, 2.8%. And modest is an interesting word to use there, because really they conclude that it doesn't really have any effect. That's such a small percentage, and there's certainly no statistical power to suggest it's going to be more than that. So really, to some extent, it's probably less than 2.8% is the answer. And they found that the AI tools had no significant impact on earnings or recorded hours in any occupation. And they found specifically that there's no evidence that firms with greater adoption have had any changes in the total employment, wage bills, or retention. And the users said they had no changes in earnings. So even when there was this sort of small, modest amount of change, it wasn't being translated into better pay. People who used AI tools ultimately weren't getting better conditions. So there's some interesting things going on here, and I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about this study. So AI tools are not saving teachers time. Here's my headline, and I think I'm very justified in this, having dug through this paper and had a good old look. So here is the table, which there's a lot of statistics here, and some of them don't make a lot of sense. The sort of three end columns are, the two middle columns are to some extent part of the first column, and then covariance, which we don't need to worry about too much here. But essentially, they've looked at all of the professionals, all of the professions in the study, and they have split them into encouraged to use AI tools and not encouraged, which is just a sort of factor of their workplace. And then they've looked at the percentage time savings in terms of their total work hours. And look, there's teachers right at the bottom, way below average, and right down at the bottom there with very, very low average time savings. So 1% or 0.6%. And really, I would suggest those are negligible. And we'll get to this in a minute, because actually, I wonder if, and this comes back to researchers maybe not asking the right questions, there were actually times when the AI was adding time on. You'll see what I mean in a moment. All right, but essentially, headline here, AI tools are not saving teachers time, according to this study in Denmark. How are teachers using their time savings? This was a great question, I thought, which was very odd. And so these are the whole findings from all workers, I should say. They didn't separate these results out by the different occupations. So how do workers allocate the time savings? This table shows the vast majority reallocate this time to other job tasks. So in other words, they didn't get more breaks or more leisure time. In addition, and this was intriguing, 25% spend more time on the same tasks they initially saved time on, especially when employers actively encourage chatbot use. So what's unclear to me here is, do we mean sort of the same types of tasks, but they're able to do them in more depth or more of them? Hypothesis A. Or do we mean, intriguingly, they have to go back and pretty much do them again or do more checking because the AI is doing them? Hypothesis B. I'll tell you why I've been thinking about that. I've read lots of things in the press this week about people who are saying that they've been brought in to correct AI errors, and they've been paid many, many, many more times than the original amount they've been paid if they just got to do the job in the first place. I'm seeing that all over different industries. It's very interesting. I think there are people now, if this is true, or I've read in the media, that have a specific profession of going in and correcting AI code because it's prone to the same types of error, and people often use it without any expertise and then get themselves in quite the pickle. So interesting question there that I'm not sure about. This one was very interesting. So this is the reported new job tasks across major categories for each occupation. So you'll see there I've highlighted teachers for you. So this is what were people doing when they were using AI tools. So teachers are spending some time in AI integration. They're spending a massive amount of time on AI ethics and compliance, much, much, much more than anybody else. And really the second profession that's doing that in any comparable amount is legal professionals, but even so, teachers way, way more. So what's going on here? Ensuring AI use follows ethical, legal and organisational standards. Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's going back to the first study, is teachers often checking student work to see if it's AI generated, or trying perhaps to have those conversations, maybe prove it is or it isn't. I suspect they're also trying to do harm reduction and thinking about AI interacting with students and trying to make sure that those things aren't harming them. There's a few examples in the paper, but I'd be really interested to see what you think that AI ethics and compliance is about, because that's quite an interesting result. So my question here is, are they using AI tools if actually what they're doing is ethics and compliance work? And you'll see there again, legal professionals, maybe there's a bit of a parallel here between the two industries, because what they're doing maybe is accuracy checking over and over again. Maybe, as I said, trying to produce something that reduces harm and mitigate for harm. And you have to ask the question, given what the study headlined at, it doesn't reduce particularly time. Is it worth it? Is it worth it for the teachers in this particular study and more generally? So this is an interesting one. AI tools are creating new tasks. And we could argue that perhaps they're saving a little bit of time and then teachers are using that time on AI tools. But if you look at this graph, this shows workloads from AI chatbots. So the study concludes that AI tools have created new workloads. It's not super clear to me what new workloads mean, as in new streams of work or more work in those streams, or a bit of both. And here we've got teachers headlining the graph right at the top, which shows that they are spending, in terms of their workloads from AI chatbots, huge amounts of time on new tasks. And there's something that rings an alarm bell there for me as an ex-teacher, because one of the things that I used to hate was doing new things. There's an opportunity cost. You have to spend some time learning how to do the thing, getting to grips with the thing. Troubleshooting is difficult. If you run into problems, either you need to make yourself the expert or find someone who is an expert and ask them. And so doing new tasks as a teacher is not straightforward, and we don't really want to ask teachers to do it unless there's a really good reason, because teaching itself is so messy and complex that even kind of redoing old tasks is hard enough. Interesting. So I've been thinking, and here are some of my general thoughts, having read lots of these research papers. As I told you, there is some level at this point of positivity in the research I'm seeing, which is fairly astounding. I keep seeing conclusions where researchers say AI has promise to do X, Y, and Z. This study has shown that AI has value in doing X, Y, and Z. However, and however is almost always, we need a human in the loop. We need a person, presumably someone who's already working in this area, who's an expert, and that human in the loop needs to do oversight, accuracy checking, and accountability for that AI. Well, here's how it looks in my head. So on the left, this was what I was thinking maybe a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. AI tools are going to give us a helpful and friendly assistant. They'll be accurate, reliable, and incredibly fast. I think speed is really the thing here that most impresses. You type in a chat, you get a chat back, and that thing is so fast. It can automate boring, menial, or repetitive tasks. Haven't we been told this? The best uses of AI are to make the humans free to do more creativity. As yet, I haven't seen much evidence of that. Will make your job easier. That would be nice. However, if it makes your job easier, does that mean your employer just asks you to do more things, pays you less? Insert other consequence here. Does it mean that you have more leisure time and breaks? Not in this study that we saw. No consequences, right? You have open a chat window, ask a question. It's fast, it's easy. There's absolutely no downside. And that honestly was how it was sold, I think, and continues to be sold. However, I actually think what we've got is something that I've called the Teflon tornado, because it seems to cause a lot of damage and nothing sticks to this guy. So instead of a helpful, friendly assistant, I seem to have now acquired an employee. I didn't ask to have this employee. I'm not being paid to line manage them. I maybe don't have the skills to line manage them because they're unlike any other employee I've managed, because they're completely non-accountable. At no point are they accountable for anything. But boy, do they like to make things up. So we've got at times wildly inaccurate, but they'll double down on mistakes. So super certain about things, even when they're wrong. So we don't really know when they're wrong. And so it's like I'm being asked to line manage an employee where I need to always be more expert at things than them. I always need to be one step ahead. Now, this to me doesn't sound like a friendly assistant. This sounds like babysitting, parenting, taking care of some sort of animal. Doesn't sound fun, and it certainly doesn't sound like it's in any way going to benefit me or reduce my time. We'll see. Cannot be relied upon to do more boring, menial, or repetitive tasks with consistency or accuracy. This is a big one. AI is really, 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 really bad at doing those things, even though we keep being told they're great. And I keep, you know, people keep sending me all of these examples of AI doing wild, crazy, and sometimes very funny things in the name of just keep doing that, because just keep doing that rarely means that. There's always edge cases. There's always a sort of new element. There's always something that throws the AI for a loop. And then again, with that, just keep doing that mentality, it can cause some very, very difficult results, very strange results. And then you add in that sort of random hallucination, which isn't random, but it looks to us often like randomness. And you really do get some results that are very odd and bizarre. We'll add tasks to your job. This is the study I want. And if you're out there doing this research, I'm so excited to read what you have to say, because this is my hypothesis. I'm willing to be wrong, but I think what we have right now adds tasks to your jobs overall. And you saw it in that last study. We've got all these new tasks from AI because we have to do this compliance and ethical monitoring and accountability and oversight and checking and preventing harm. And it feels more and more like babysitting a toddler at this point. And as we know, that's, you know, an extremely full-time and very difficult job. And then finally, no consequences. I've talked about this before, so I'll just briefly mention it here, but AI uses a lot of resources and it is absolutely not consequence-free. Okay, so that was the update for this month. I would be delighted to hear your thoughts. You can comment in the chat below so you can tell me how you found it, if you have suggestions for future research you'd like me to summarise, and what sorts of questions you'd like to see researched in the future. I've been Dr. Lucy Rycroft-Smith. It was an absolute pleasure, and I'll see you again soon.